Facts are stubborn things, and whatsoever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. John Adams.
Facts are stubborn things, but not half so stubborn as fallacies. Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. The Book of Mormon begins about 600 BCE with the Lord warning the prophet Lehi of the impending destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So Lehi flees with his family into the wilderness, traveling south to the Red Sea, where they set up camp in a valley near a river. Continuing their journey, they travel south-southeast direction down the coast of the Red Sea. Then, at some point, they turn almost directly east until they come to the Indian Ocean, where they build a ship and cross over to America. Apologists have given much attention to the route traveled by Lehi in an attempt to link the vague description in the Book of Mormon with specific locations in Arabia. They have become so confident that one apologist reviews the evidence under the title, "I bet you can't refute this Book of Mormon evidence." This video deals with the first leg of the journey, from Jerusalem to their first camp. I will not only show that the apologists have manipulated both text and terrain to create the appearance of a correlation and proof of the Book of Mormon as a historical record, but I will also show how Joseph Smith created his text by simply looking at a map and making inferences, some of which turned out to be incorrect. As it turns out, the apologists have trouble matching the text to the real world as soon as Lehi flees Jerusalem. 1 Nephi 2 verse 4 reads, "And it came to pass that he departed into the wilderness, and he left his house and the land of his inheritance, and took nothing with him, save it were his family, and provisions and tents, and departed into the wilderness." Note the pseudo-biblical language, repetition of the phrase "departed into the wilderness," and that the wilderness begins when Lehi leaves his house. Continuing with the next verse, "And he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, and he did travel in the wilderness with his family." Again, note the repetition of traveled, did travel in the wilderness. Also note that there is only one border by the Red Sea, not two as some apologists suppose. The language is awkward, but it simply states that Lehi came down near the Red Sea and then moved nearer the Red Sea when he passed into the borders. This border is merely and obviously the shoreline along the coast. So, he came down near the Red Sea at the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, but then passed into the borders to travel along the coast. Much later in the journey, we are told that they left the place they called Shazer, following the same direction, keeping in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, which were in the borders near the Red Sea. Again, this simply states that Lehi traveled down the coast of Arabia. Continuing with the next verse, verse 6, "And it came to pass that when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley, by the side of a river of water." The text appears to describe Lehi and his family traveling south from Jerusalem to the Gulf of Aqaba in 3 days, which is impossible. This problem was recognized as early as October 1831, when one reviewer of the Book of Mormon in the Christian Watchman observed, "This, it must be confessed, was a most extraordinary journey. To go from Jerusalem to the Red Sea with his wife and children, tents and baggage, in 3 days, was to travel with unparalleled celerity or speed." The apologetic website, Book of Mormon Central, admits this is a problem. The distance between Jerusalem and the Red Sea by road is about 180 miles, 290 kilometers. Even if the party traveled with loaded camels, as would seem necessary in order to carry their provisions, they would normally have covered an average of only 20 to 25 miles or 32 to 40 kilometers per day. At this rate, it would take 7 to 9 days. Another apologist website, called Supporting Evidences, estimates that the 180-mile trip would have taken Lehi's family about 14 days to travel this distance. According to LDS archaeologist Jeffrey R. Chadwick, at 18 to 20 miles a day, with at least some of the party traveling on foot, the trip would take about 10 days, not including the Sabbath. To escape this problem, the apologists have tried to take advantage of the repetitiveness of the text, arguing that the 3 days of travel only refers to the time spent traveling in the border wilderness along the coast of the Red Sea, not to the entire time in the wilderness. As early as 1961, Ariel L. Crowley, an amateur historian and LDS judge living in Idaho, argued, "When Nephi wrote in verse 6, when he, Lehi, had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent. The wilderness he should be understood as referring to was that wilderness which he had just finished describing in the preceding verse, i.e., the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea." More recently, the Book of Mormon Central website similarly argues, "The journey of 3 days does not refer to the distance from Jerusalem to the Red Sea. Rather, their party first departed from Jerusalem and came down near the Red Sea, and after that traveled 3 more days until they reached their first campsite in the valley of Lemuel. It makes clear sense to understand the 3-day journey as a reference to the specific segment of wilderness travel near the shore of the Red Sea, which had just been mentioned in the previous verse. Thus, the most likely interpretation, based on sound textual analysis, also happens to be the most geographically realistic. However, notice that they quote a different part of the verse than Crowley. The words they quote do not pertain to traveling in the border wilderness, but rather states that Lehi came down near the borders of the Red Sea. Only the next part of the verse mentions traveling in the wilderness border, which is located near the Red Sea. The reason for this shift will become clear, but it's clearly not sound textual analysis. In his 2015 book, Lehi and Sariah in Arabia, Warren P. Aston, an independent researcher based in Brisbane, Australia, similarly argued, "A careful reading of 1 Nephi 2, 5-6 makes it clear that it was not from Jerusalem, but rather from the head of the Red Sea, where the twin cities of Eilat and Aqaba now lie, that the Lehites traveled another 3 days in the wilderness. Reaching the Red Sea had already required as much as 10 days' travel from Jerusalem, so the 3 days' travel further into the wilderness began at this point. This allows us to identify the general area where this significant campsite must have been, as 50 to 70 miles distant from the Aqaba area." Again, notice how Aston avoids quoting the entire phrase, "in the wilderness, in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea." More recently, apologist Jeff Lindsay asserted, "This 3 days of travel is a continuation of this episode of traveling in the wilderness in the borders near or nearer the Red Sea." Here, Lindsay conflates traveling near the borders and in the borders, making it sound like Lehi traveled in 2 borders, one near and the other near the Red Sea. I will explain why he did this in a moment. At this point, it is important to see that the apologists want to argue that the 3 days of travel in the wilderness, mentioned in verse 6, refers to a specific wilderness, the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, rather than to the general wilderness. It is the most natural and likely reading, they argue, because this specific wilderness had just been mentioned in the previous verse, and is the most geographically realistic. However, the passage clearly implies that the 3 days refers to the entire time Lehi had traveled in the wilderness, not just in the borders along the shoreline. Let's read verse 5 again. And he, Lehi, came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are near the Red Sea. And he did travel in the wilderness with his family, which consisted of my mother, Sariah, and my elder brothers, who were Laman, Lemuel, and Sam. Did Lehi travel with his family only in the wilderness in the borders? No, of course not. So the previous use of wilderness is general, not specific. The text speaks only of one wilderness in which Lehi traveled before setting up camp in the valley he called Lemuel. Nephi's superscript to his first book supports this reading. And the Lord warns Lehi to depart out of the land of Jerusalem. He taketh 3 days' journey into the wilderness with his family. This superscript, which is part of the original text, as indicated by the I, Nephi, is ignored by most apologists. However, it was noted by the late Brigham Young University professor of ancient scripture, William J. Hamlin, who attempted to shorten the 180 miles to 130 or 40 by defining wilderness to mean the area outside Judea, which Hamlin believed was synonymous with the land of Jerusalem mentioned by Nephi. Hamlin, however, acknowledged that even this distance may be excessive. Nevertheless, Hamlin's attempt to shorten the distance doesn't hold water, since Nephi 2 verse 4 clearly states that Lehi left his house and the land of his inheritance and departed into the wilderness, implying that the wilderness began just outside Jerusalem, not 50 miles away with an arbitrary political border. So, on the first leg of Lehi's journey, the apologists have already run into trouble with the Book of Mormon's narrative, forcing them to adopt an unlikely and tortured interpretation of the text. In the context of the narrative, it makes no sense to have Lehi continue down the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba 3 more days before sending his sons back to Jerusalem twice, once to get the brass plates and at another time to get Ishmael and his family. Why would he take his family as well as Ishmael's into such a vast wasteland without some plan? It makes more sense for Lehi to camp near the top of the Red Sea, with many options before him, rather than traveling halfway down the eastern coast of Aqaba before getting the Liahona. While most interpreters read borders which are nearer the Red Sea as a reference to the coastline, George Potter and Richard Wellington argue in their 2003 book, Lehi in the Wilderness, that borders refers to mountain ranges. To support this view, they assert that the Hebrew word Jebel means border, and that Jebel cognates with Arabic Jabal, which means mountain. The problem is that the Hebrew word Jebul doesn't mean mountain, it means border, as Jeffrey R. Chadwick pointed out in his 2005 review of the book. Chadwick, who has served as professor of archaeology and Near Eastern studies at the Brigham Young University Jerusalem Center in Israel, and also as associate professor of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, observed, because 2 words of related languages may be consonantally cognate does not require that they mean the same thing. Arabic Jabal means mountain, but Hebrew Javul does not. It means border or limit. Javul appears hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible in both singular and plural form, and in not a single one of those contexts does the word mean mountain. In Hebrew, the term for mountain is har, and the plural term for mountains is harim. In a 2016 article in the online apologetic journal Interpreter, Jeff Lindsay defended Potter and Wellington by arguing that, according to Strong's Concordance, the Hebrew word Gabul, normally translated border, can also refer to a concrete object marking a limit, like a mountain range. The bull can be a physical object functioning as a barrier or limit, like a shoreline or wall around the temple, even a mountain range. But that's not how Potter and Wellington use it. Instead, they use borders as a synonym for mountains, which it isn't. Thus, when Nephi says Lehi left Jerusalem and came down by the border near the shore of the Red Sea, Potter and Wellington interpret this to mean they came down by the mountains that were near the Red Sea. They even describe Lehi traveling south of Aqaba along the shore about 44 miles until he is blocked by the shoreline mountains extending into the sea, which forced him to turn east into the mountains and ultimately to a wadi or valley called Taib al-Izm. According to Potter and Wellington, this is when Lehi entered and traveled in the borders or mountains which are nearer the Red Sea. They also state that Lehi camped in the valley that was in the borders or mountains. So, as Chadwick pointed out nearly 20 years ago, Porter and Wellington's attempt to substitute borders with mountains is inappropriate, and Lindsay's attempt to save them fails. The simple substitution of borders and mountains has also led Porter and Wellington into another false reading in connection with the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, which they interpret as a reference to two borders matching two mountain ranges near the Gulf of Aqaba. This graphic, provided in their 2006 video, Discovering Lehi's Trail, shows the two mountain ranges they speak of. In their book, Potter and Wellington state that from the top of Jabal al-Lawz, located about 80 miles south of Aqaba, we could see that there were two mountain ranges in Midian. Both ranges ran north to south. One, which included al-Lawz, ran about 20 miles inland from the coast, and the other a shoreline range of mountains, or borders, that ran along the Gulf of Aqaba. Making two distinct mountain ranges is all their own doing. What they were looking at was Wadi Ifal, running partway through the lower mountains. It was just like Nephi had written, they remark. There are two mountain ranges, borders, one near the Red Sea and one nearer the Red Sea. Only Nephi didn't say that. Rather, he said, and he, Lehi, came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea. This simply states that Lehi came down by or near the borders, and then he entered in and traveled in the borders. And when he did so, he was nearer the Red Sea. Nothing is said about two borders, let alone two mountain ranges. He is near the borders and then in the borders, one border. Why would Nephi say they came down by or near the mountains near the Red Sea, when they were near the same mountain range for almost the whole trip? The most likely route from Jerusalem would have been the Araba Valley, running south from the Dead Sea to Aqaba. In fact, the mountains near the Red Sea, that Porter and Wellington call borders, actually are a continuation of the range that runs down the east side of the Araba Valley into northwestern Arabia. According to Potter and Wellington's reading, the text brings Lehi south of Jerusalem by the mountains near the Red Sea, but the next sentence jumps 40 miles south to another mountain range without any explanation as to how he got there. It makes more sense for Lehi to arrive near the borders of the Red Sea and then briefly travel in the borders before setting up camp. In 1995, Paul Hedengren proposed Lehi located his camp in Wadi Nuwaybi, just north of the border between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But this has been rejected by most apologists because it doesn't have a perennial source of water and is not 3 days from Aqaba. Equating borders with mountains is also incompatible with the argument that the 3 days is limited to Lehi's traveling in the borders nearer the Red Sea. This would seem to imply that the 3 days didn't start until they were 40 miles south of Aqaba. Potter and Wellington seem to be aware of this and deliberately avoid quoting borders near the Red Sea when discussing the 75-mile limitation for the 3-day trip to the valley of Lemuel. Sometimes they and other apologists quote the previous sentence, stating that Lehi traveled 3 days in the wilderness near the shore of the Red Sea, and then 40 miles later in the borders or mountains nearer the Red Sea. But this isn't what the text says. Lehi first comes down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea. No mention of traveling in these borders. He is only near them, not in them. The only traveling mentioned is in the borders nearer the Red Sea. So how is it that the 3 days and 74 miles begin at the top of Aqaba if borders is to be equated with mountains? Again, this makes no sense. So, any apologist who defines borders as mountains and then argues that the 3 days of travel refers to the wilderness nearer the Red Sea is arguing inconsistently and incoherently. I have taken time to explain this to show that we are dealing with a very tortured reading of the text. A reading that pretends to know what Hebrew word Joseph Smith translated incorrectly. From a 19th century perspective, the mistake in distance is understandable. Joseph Smith would not have known how many miles the ancient caravan could travel in a day. He certainly had no experience with camels. Possibly, he didn't even know how many miles there were between Jerusalem and the northern tip of Aqaba. Not all pre-1830 maps, especially world maps, had a graphic scale showing mileage, such as this map of Canaan in Edward Wells' A Compendium to the Holy Bible, London, 1817. He may have even been looking at separate maps for Palestine or Bible lands and Arabia. However, there is another possibility, depending on how much effort Joseph Smith put into coming up with the 3 days for Lehi's trip from Jerusalem to the tip of Aqaba. Parallels between Nephi's account and the exodus of the Israelites have been noted. One passage in particular has received some notice. And it came to pass that when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. And it came to pass that he built an altar of stones, and made an offering unto the Lord, and gave thanks unto the Lord our God. In Exodus, God instructs Moses to take the elders of Israel before the king of Egypt, and declare, "The Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us, and now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God." In his well-known Bible commentary, Adam Clarke explained, evidently intending Mount Sinai, which is reputed to be about 3 days' journey, the shortest way, from the land of Goshen. Something interesting happens when one measures the distance between Goshen and Mount Sinai, said to be a 3-day journey. This map, published by Carey and Son in Philadelphia in 1820, traces the journey of the Israelites during the Exodus from Egypt. Using the measuring scale, it appears that the distance is about 220 miles. While this is an impossible distance, Joseph Smith may have nevertheless taken his cue for Lehi's journey from his knowledge of the Exodus. Similar to Lehi, Smith fled his enemies in Manchester, New York in December 1827 and traveled 3 days in the wilderness and pitched his tent, so to speak, in a valley by the side of a river of water. Much like the Susquehanna, which winds its way south and empties into the north end of the Chesapeake Bay, and finally into the Atlantic Ocean, Lehi's river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, apparently referring to the Gulf of Aqaba. I will have more to say about what I think Joseph Smith had in mind when he located Lehi's camp in a valley next to a river near the end of this video. I have uncovered some very incriminating evidence you won't want to miss. But first, I will show that the river and valley that a majority of the apologists believe is the best candidate for the river Laman and valley of Lemuel, has serious problems. As mentioned, after traveling 3 days, Lehi set up camp in a valley by the side of a river of water, which he named the Valley of Lemuel and the river Laman, after his 2 oldest sons. Verse 8 states that the river emptied into the Red Sea, and the valley was in the borders near the mouth thereof. This would suggest that the valley and Lehi's campsite were near the seashore. Lehi gave clues about location when he implored his rebellious sons to be more like this river and valley. Observing that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, he spake unto Laman, saying, O that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness. And he also spake unto Lemuel, O that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast, and immovable, in keeping the commandments of the Lord. Note that verse 8 states that the river emptied into the Red Sea, and that verse 9 says it was continually running into the fountain of the Red Sea. Most interpreters have understood this to mean that the river emptied into the Gulf of Aqaba, and that the Gulf flowed into the Red Sea. However, this is a serious problem for the Book of Mormon, because there are no significant rivers anywhere along the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, or the Red Sea for that matter. The apologists are well aware that the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Agriculture and Water, with the assistance of the U.S. Geological Service, after spending 4 years surveying the peninsula's water resources, concluded that Saudi Arabia may be the world's largest country without any perennial rivers or streams. This problem constitutes a second strike against the Book of Mormon. But that hasn't stopped the apologists from trying to find what they call a plausible candidate. In 1999, George Potter, an independent researcher, identified Wadi Taib al-Izm, located about 74 miles south of the modern city of Aqaba, near the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba in the province of Tabuk in Saudi Arabia, as the Book of Mormon's Valley of Lemuel. Potter developed this claim more fully in a 2003 book co-authored with Richard Wellington titled Lehi in the Wilderness. While not universally accepted, this site has become the favored location for Lehi's first long-term campsite for most apologists. A wadi is a valley, ravine, or channel that is dry except in the rainy season, typically November to April. Prior to 1999, a few other candidates for the Valley of Lemuel had been proposed, but all required an unsatisfying explanation as to why the location only had water flowing during the rainy season and not year-round. The main attractiveness of Wadi Taib al-Izm is the presence of a small gravity-fed spring that originates about 3.5 miles up the nearly 4-mile narrow and winding canyon. Potter remarked on the uniqueness of Taib al-Izm in 1999, stating, I have surveyed the entire Arabian shoreline of the Gulf of Aqaba, and I have found only rocky valleys almost entirely devoid of vegetation and with no flowing water, that is, with the exception of Wadi Taib al-Izm. In 2019, Aston similarly stated, after examining on the ground the entire eastern coast of the Red Sea, from Aqaba south to the Yemen border, I can state with certainty that there is only one such perennial stream reaching the Red Sea today. Thus, Taib al-Izm stands out as the only wadi with a freshwater spring that runs towards the Red Sea, even if it doesn't actually reach the Red Sea except perhaps in the rainy season. So there is a great deal of pressure on the apologists to make Taib al-Izm work. Nevertheless, this identification depends on a dubious reading of the text and a manipulation of the terrain. In a 2005 review of Lehi and the Wilderness, LDS archaeologist Jeffrey R. Chadwick raised several questions about their identification of Wadi Taib al-Izm as the Valley of Lemuel, which have never been adequately addressed despite strenuous efforts to do so. Chadwick, who argued for a different location for the Valley of Lemuel and offered his own dubious readings of the text, nevertheless outlined several problems with the Wadi Taib al-Izm identification. In one very specific instance, the fact that its small stream has no mouth, the wadi flatly fails to match Nephi's description, and in other respects, such as coastal inaccessibility, its distance from the Gulf's north shore, and the difficulty of locating its inland access, the wadi presents problems when considered in the context of Nephi's report. Later, in the same review, Chadwick repeats these problems. The difficulties of identifying Taib al-Izm with the Valley of Lemuel include its inaccessibility from the coast and its difficult-to-find inland access. The fact that its inland access was 74 miles from Aqaba via their Land Rover suggests that it was not only difficult to find, but too far for Lehi's group to have traveled in just 3 days. To summarize, Chadwick has identified the following problems with naming Wadi Taib al-Izm as the River Laman and Valley of Lemuel. The stream has no mouth that empties into the sea. It is too far from the Gulf's northern shore. In Lehi's time, it had no coastal access. The inland access is difficult to find. Other problems that I will be discussing are the following. Taib al-Izm is in the wrong location. It should be at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. It's not a river. It's not continually running into the sea. The valley is too long. This last item will become clear later. I will now take a closer look at each of these problems. The main problem with Wadi Taib al-Izm, as previously discussed, is that it is in the wrong place according to the Book of Mormon's description. The river and valley should be at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, but even if we allow the apologetic argument that it was a 3-day journey from the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, Wadi Taib al-Izm is too far, as Chadwick has pointed out. Potter and Wellington, and apologists after them, have claimed that the distance from the top of the Gulf of Aqaba to Taib al-Izm is about 74 miles, which they argue is within the upper limit of feasibility. However, Chadwick thought 75 miles from the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba seems impossibly far for the group to have reached in only 3 days' travel. As I will show, the distance is actually greater than represented. Of course, the apologists want the distance to be as short as possible. In his 1999 article, Potter said that it is just over 70 miles, and that a reasonable estimate would be that they traveled between 45 and 75 miles during those 3 days, averaging 15 to 25 miles per day. Later, in the same article, he states, the distance from Aqaba to the canyon is almost exactly 74 miles. Based on Potter's work, S. Kent Brown, an emeritus professor of ancient scripture at BYU, declared, I find no definitive reason to doubt that the family of Lehi and Sariah could have reached a campsite some 75 miles from the northern tip of the Red Sea. In his 2019 article, Aston put the distance at 73 miles, following Potter and Wellington, and estimated that loaded camels can travel about 32 to 40 kilometers or 20 to 25 miles per day, which he believed was feasible for a 3-day journey from Aqaba to the back entrance of Taib al-Izm. 4 years earlier, in his book Lehi and Sariah in Arabia, he had said, a careful reading of 1 Nephi 2, 5-6 makes it clear that it was not from Jerusalem, but rather from the head of the Red Sea, where the twin cities of Elat and Aqaba now lie, that the Lehites traveled another 3 days in the wilderness. Reaching the Red Sea had already required as much as 10 days' travel from Jerusalem, so the 3 days' travel further into the wilderness began at this point. This allows us to identify the general area where this significant campsite must have been, as a 3 days' travel with loaded camels, and therefore it must be in the order of 50 to 70 miles distant from the Aqaba area. Most apologetic websites and video presentations represent the distance as 74 miles. In 2017, Book of Mormon Central, for example, posted a link and text to a documentary titled, "Have the Valley of Lemuel and River Laman Been Found?" In discussing the discovery of Taib al-Ism by George Potter and Craig Thorstead, it is claimed they had found Wadi Taib al-Ism, a narrow valley 74 miles south of Aqaba. Remarkably, estimates for daily travel in the Arabian deserts in antiquity ranged between 15 and 25 miles per day. This valley, with its river, falls just within the plausible distance of a 3-day journey. On the Book of Mormon Central website, this last sentence reads differently. Wadi Taib al-Ism thus falls just within the maximum distance of a 3-day journey, 45 to 75 miles, from the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, a northeastern extension of the Red Sea. Note carefully that this documentary includes this graphic showing the 3-day journey from the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba to Wadi Taib al-Ism, which is said to be 74 miles. A similar map appears in another apologetic video titled Book of Mormon Evidence, Valley of Lemuel, where it is also stated, the distance between Wadi Taib al-Ism and Aqaba is 74 miles, within the maximum distance. In a presentation to the Joseph Smith Restoration Conference in Idaho on the 30th of June, 2021, Potter represented the total mileage as 72 miles from the top of Aqaba and included this graphic. In another presentation given to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum and posted on YouTube on the 13th of December, 2023, Potter played part of a video titled Discovering Lehi's Trail, which included this graphic. This graphic incorrectly locates the starting point at Port Aqaba at the top of the Gulf. Another graphic shows the same starting point, and the narrator states, our trip speedometer read 72 miles. We had driven almost the equivalent of a full 3 days camel ride, and still there was only rocky terrain rather than a fertile valley. At this point, the wadi took a sudden turn to the west and headed for the tall shoreline mountains. Here we found something Lehi would have been very grateful to have come upon, an oasis of date palms. Within a few hundred yards of entering the canyon, we came to a true discovery, a spring head that fed a small desert river. Here was a stream of pure water. The video doesn't give the total mileage to the oasis or canyon spring, where Lehi would have pitched his tent, but it's in the order of 3 to 4 miles. So we are talking about 75 to 76 miles, even according to Potter and Wellington. Unfortunately, the distance as presented by Potter and Wellington, on which Aston and others have relied, is misleading. What some of their fellow apologists don't know is that Porter and his traveling companions didn't begin their measurement from the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, but actually 16 miles down the coast at the port of Aqaba, located near the border between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Apparently, they had uncritically accepted Potter and Wellington's statement that the valley was located within a 3 days walk or camel ride beyond the northeast tip of the Red Sea. The first clue that something was not quite right about the mileage came when Potter described the first part of the 3-day journey south from Aqaba to the Mazhafa Mountains as 44 miles. Anciently, one didn't simply go down the Gulf Coast to the entrance of Taib al-Ism as one does today, which is 78.3 miles, already over the 75-mile maximum. The Mazhafa Mountains jut out into the Red Sea just past a small promontory, Ras Swahil al-Sugur. So if Lehi were traveling down the coast of Aqaba, he would have run into these mountains, something Joseph Smith didn't anticipate. At this point, Lehi would be forced to turn east into the mountains and through the maze of wadis and approach the canyon at Taib al-Izm from its inland entrance. In his 1999 essay, Potter said that the mountains that impede travel along the coast are 44 miles south of Aqaba. The most direct route takes a person south from Aqaba 44 miles along the coast. Here, one reaches a 6,000-foot mountain range that blocks further coastwise travel. The true distance from Aqaba to Ras Swahil al-Sugur is 57 miles. This led me to surmise that when Porter said from Aqaba, he must have meant from the modern city limits near the port of Aqaba, rather than from the point where Lehi would have entered into the borders of the Red Sea, traveling south from Jerusalem, which is misleading, but it helped him get the mileage he needed. The port of Aqaba to Ras Suwayhil al-Sugur is 43.5 miles. So obviously, Potter didn't begin measuring at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba as represented. This allowed him to shave about 16 miles off the total miles Lehi needed to travel in his 3-day journey. Following my interview with Stephen Murphy, posted on YouTube on the 27th of August, 2023, wherein, among other things, I discussed some of the problems with the apologetic attempt to link the Book of Mormon with specific locations in Arabia, George Potter commented and insisted that the distance from Aqaba to the Taib al-Izm oasis was 72 miles. So I asked, where did you start clocking the mileage? And he admitted, we started the speedometer at the port of Al-Aqaba. When I asked why he began clocking the mileage 10 miles down the coast, actually 16, I got no answer. While we still have about 30 miles to go, the apologists are already in trouble with their Taib al-Izm proposal. While mistaken about mileage, Chadwick correctly observed it would take at least 2 days for Lehi's party to cover those 50 miles on camels. If they proceeded more slowly, looking for a campsite, or if they were traveling on foot, it would take the group 3 days to go from the Ezion Geber area to Ber Marsha. Ezion Geber is the ancient seaport of Solomon mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, located at the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba in what is now Jordan, somewhere along the coast a little south of Aqaba city center. And Ber Marsha is about 2 miles north of Ras Suwayhil al-Sugur. This is where the journey to Taib al-Izm gets more difficult. Turning inland at or just below Ber Marsha, Lehi's group would need to travel, according to Chadwick, another 30 miles through the interior mountain passes to the upper access of Taib al-Izm. He then argues, their total of 74 miles would be essentially impossible for Lehi's party to have traveled in just 3 days, especially along the unfamiliar and twisting inland wadis. Here, Chadwick sticks with their 74 miles, despite knowing it is at least 85 miles. The last 30 miles were not as simple as the first 57 along the coast. When Lehi turned inland toward the mountains, he would have been confronted with deciding which of the several wadis to go up. Aston determined that 2 of these wadis, Wadi Hasha and Wadi Hulab, intersect with other interior wadis that then offer straightforward, perfectly feasible access to Wadi Taib al-Izm. After considerable investigation, Aston assessed the more defined and southerly route of the 2, Wadi al-Hulab, as the more likely. It leads into the mountains to meet a broad, dry valley, Wadi al-Sharma, which runs almost southward until it intersects with Wadi Taib al-Izm. So Aston assumes Lehi took the best possible route to Taib al-Izm, no doubt without any delay or having to explore, and at top speed. Aston makes it sound like reaching Wadi Tayyib al-Ism is a simple matter, but between the entrances of the wadis near Bir Marsha and Wadi al-Sharma, there is a maze of wadis. In this image from Google Earth, we are looking south from the area near Bir Marsha towards Tayyib al-Ism. Wadi al-Sharma does intersect with Wadi Tayyib al-Ism, as Aston states. But to reach the oasis, Lehi's party would have to change direction, instead of continuing in a generally southeast direction, and travel about 3.5 miles west towards the granite obstruction. This situation caused Chadwick to state, its inland access is many miles away from the coast, in a location that, to me at least, seems unlikely for Lehi to have discovered. Nevertheless, the total mileage from the top of the Gulf of Aqaba to the proposed valley of Lemuel is greater than either Potter or Aston represents. From Aqaba to Wadi al-Hulab, which is where Aston thinks Lehi turned inland, is 51.3 miles. Add to that another 37.3 miles for the winding journey to Tayyib al-Ism, and the total is about 88 miles. Potter's adjusted mileage is the same. Potter said that he traveled 44 miles south from the port of Aqaba and then took the most southern wadi, 28 miles to Tayyib al-Ism, which is 72 miles as he himself has claimed. However, if we add the 16 miles from Aqaba city center to the port of Aqaba, the total mileage is more like 88 miles. However, 88 miles would only bring Lehi to the oasis or back entrance into the canyon. But if one reads the text as stating that Lehi set up camp in the valley near the mouth of the river, it would require another 3 miles, making it a total of 91 miles. In his 2007 article, Brown, who situated Lehi's camp in the canyon, acknowledged that in his view, the only serious objection to Wadi Tayyib al-Ism is the apparent difficulty of reaching this site from the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba. We have to hold onto this point as a negative stroke against this site. His solution was to argue that the use of camels for the older family members allowed the group to move as quickly as its younger members could go. When we factor in the ages of the family members, even a 75-mile trek from the north rim of the Gulf of Aqaba does not seem out of the question. But why assume Lehi and his family raced at top speed to Tayyib al-Ism? Because that's what's needed? Sounds like circular reasoning to me. Now that we know that the distance was more than 75 miles, I wonder if Brown still thinks a top-speed race to Tayyib al-Ism is feasible. Recently, after I informed apologist Jeff Lindsay of the true mileage from Aqaba to Tayyib al-Ism, he responded, "But frankly, if they had to travel a few miles over the normal limit of about 75 miles, by sleeping less and traveling longer on the third day, for example, I don't think that's a serious problem. If the ideal route turns out to be 80 or 85 miles from Aqaba, or if we have to assume Nephi started their 3-day journey a few miles south of Aqaba, it's not a fundamental problem. First, we are not talking about a few miles or even 80 or 85 miles. It's 88 or 91 miles, which is 16 or 19 miles more than Potter claimed. One gets the idea that Lindsay is committed to his theory and wants to move the goalposts. But we must ask, even if it were possible, why would Lehi travel at such a breakneck speed? I think the apologist's theory has been stretched beyond the breaking point. To solve the distance problem, Chadwick suggested Lehi more likely camped in one of the wadis near Bir Marsha during the rainy season and may have incorrectly assumed the river was continuously flowing. Brown criticized Chadwick's assumption that there was a continuously flowing stream lasting several months as unwarranted, arguing that runoff from rains is typically sporadic and short in duration. Nevertheless, Chadwick seemed to anticipate this objection by suggesting that the stream bed itself fulfills Nephi's description, whether or not water flows through it. Unconvincingly, he maintains there is a distinction between a continually running river, as Nephi described it, and one that is continually flowing, which to me seems like a distinction without a difference. Nevertheless, he argues, a wadi's streambed may run all the way to the sea whether water happens to be flowing in it or not. The streambed itself would have been a continually running course to the ocean for the wadi's water, whether seasonal or perennial. Potter, Wellington, and Aston solved the problem in a different way. Because Wadi Tayyib al-Ism doesn't have a mouth or flow into the Red Sea, except perhaps during the rainy season, it doesn't fulfill the Book of Mormon's description of a river continually running into the fountain of the Red Sea. The lack of a mouth is certain evidence that the site could not have been the valley of Lemuel, Chadwick observed. The stream has no mouth into the Red Sea, but the stream at Tayyib al-Ism terminates nearly half a mile inland from the beach, far up the canyon. This should seal the case against Tayyib al-Ism. In his 1999 article, Potter included two graphics, an aerial view and a cross-section of the Tayyib al-Ism Canyon. The aerial view shows where the gravity-fed spring is located at the top of the canyon, which, according to Potter, is 750 feet above sea level. During the dry season, the water flow stops about 3/8 of a mile, or 1,980 feet, from the beach. A close-up of this section of the canyon shows where the water ends and goes underground. This hardly fits Nephi's description of a river continually running into the fountain of the Red Sea. To overcome this obvious deficiency, apologists have given various explanations, all of which are painfully desperate. Potter, Wellington, and Aston have speculated that anciently the small stream was bigger, having been reduced by modern pumping and reallocation, and that the shoreline was closer due to the movement of the tectonic plates. In his 1999 article, Potter argued that there has been a gradual upheaval along the eastern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, causing Wadi Tayyib al-Ism to be 200 to 400 feet higher now than in Lehi's time. Having learned from a geologist that the plate in question is currently thrusting up 1 to 5 centimeters per year, Potter mistakenly assumed it was a simple matter of working the math backwards to Lehi's time. This theory was repeated in Potter and Wellington's 2003 book, and Chadwick crushed it in his review. Chadwick observed, "It is well known that tectonic movement is not constant. There have been long periods of time when the plates of the Rift Valley did not move at all. Archaeological evidence suggests that the eastern plate of the Rift Valley has moved less than 100 feet since 1000 BC. And when the plate moves upward, it does not rise only in the Tayyib al-Ism area. It moves upward all along the eastern side of the rift. But if current shorelines had been even 200 feet lower in the Iron Age than they are now, many well-known ancient settlements along the rift's eastern shorelines could not have existed. This means that the narrow stream in Tayyib al-Ism did not have a mouth that met the Red Sea. In 600 BC, as today, that stream terminated beneath the sands of the high-walled granite canyon, nearly half a mile inland from the ocean shore. It simply could not have been the river Laman as described by Nephi. Aston acknowledges the weakness of Potter and Wellington's discussion of the tectonic theory, but he still wants to use it in his effort to connect the stream with the sea. In his 2019 article, he argues, while the sea levels in the Gulf of Aqaba may have changed little since Lehi's day, there are multiple evidences for some degree of geological uplift on the Red Sea coast, although the extent of this remains unclear. Importantly, the height of the lower reaches of Wadi Tayyib al-Ism may only require an uplift in the order of tens of feet. not the hundreds of feet variation mentioned in some commentary on the extent of the tectonic uplift. Neither Potter nor Aston tells us at what elevation the water flow ends. As mentioned, Potter included a graphic of a cross-section of the canyon in his 1999 article, but not in his 2003 book with Wellington, which shows how the floor of the canyon descends from an elevation of 750 feet to the sea. According to Potter, thus, not so long ago, the flat lower part of the canyon would have been below sea level. Therefore, if the river flowed at the same rate in Lehi's time as it does today, it would have reached all the way to the waters of the Red Sea. As I said, Potter doesn't tell us the elevation of the so-called flat part or the point where the water flow ends. Determining elevation inside the canyon is not easy. Unfortunately, Google Earth is not reliable for elevation. So instead, I will be using measurements posted by several hikers on wikiloc.com, which, after adjusting the starting point, seems more accurate for relative measurement. While not scientific or definitive, these measurements will give us an approximation for better assessing the claims of Potter and Aston. Wikiloc uses this graphic as an approximation of the trail from both the top view and side or elevation view. This hiker began near the road at the entrance of Taib al-Izm and hiked about 2 miles into the canyon and then returned to the road. Standing a short distance from the road, the hiker is already 67 feet above sea level, which is obviously off by at least 60 feet. One can get an idea of the actual elevation from this panoramic view of the Red Sea, road, and entrance into the canyon. In this photo, one can get an idea of the size of the embankment leading up to the road. Another blurry photo shows a man and a child standing by the water's edge at low tide. Finally, this series of photos shows a man walking up the embankment. From these photos, I think it's safe to estimate that the road is about 4 to 5 feet above sea level. According to the measuring tool in Google Earth, the distance from the seaside edge of the road to the hiker's starting point is about 80 feet. As I will explain, I have determined that the angle of elevation is 1.4%, or 0.8 degrees, which for 80 feet gives us an elevation of just over 1 foot. For the purposes of my analysis, I give a conservative estimate of 5 feet above sea level for the hiker's starting point. This means that I must adjust the hiker's elevation by 62 feet. As this photo shows, there is a long gradual incline into the first part of the canyon. Potter represents the lower part of the canyon as a flat gravel floor just a few feet above sea level. It looks flat, but it's not. The incline is long and gradual, but as we will see, it adds up. If it were flat, the water that accumulates during the rainy season couldn't reach the sea. When our hiker moves to the first bend of the trail, the graph reads that he has traveled 0.2 miles, or 1,056 feet, and that the elevation is 82 feet above sea level, which is a difference of 15 feet, and when adjusted is about 20 feet above sea level. This would be a 1.4% grade, or a 0.8 degree angle of elevation. Hardly noticeable. When our hiker moves to the second turn, the graph reads that he has traveled 0.4 miles, or a total of 2,112 feet, and that the elevation is 99 feet above sea level, which is a difference of 17 feet from the first turn, and an adjusted total of 37 feet above sea level. From the first turn to the second turn, the hiker traveled another 1,056 feet at a slightly increased grade of 1.6%, or a 0.92 degree angle. From the second turn to where the water ends is about 171 feet, which the graph indicates is about 105 feet above sea level, which is a difference of 6 feet or an adjusted total of 43 feet above sea level. This is where the grade starts getting steeper, at a 3.5% or 2-degree angle. Still, not too strenuous of a walk. Now that we know the tens of feet that Aston talked about is actually something like 43 feet above sea level, it is uncertain that Potter's theory can be salvaged. Even if Potter's theory were correct, that the water of the Red Sea entered the canyon about 3/8 of a mile, it would have failed to meet Nephi's description, as Chadwick pointed out in his review. Nephi noted that the valley of Lemuel was in the borders near the mouth thereof, that is, near the mouth of the river Laman. This means that the entrance to the valley of Lemuel was not right at the mouth of the river, nor was the mouth of the river in the valley itself. The mouth of the river, where it met the Red Sea, has to have been outside the valley, not exactly at the valley entrance or in the valley. The valley has to have been near the river's mouth, not right there at the mouth. Nevertheless, other apologists have offered similar arguments. Book of Mormon Central and other apologetic sites have attempted to prove the Red Sea has lowered significantly since Lehi's time by quoting the 1997 statement of Egyptologist James K. Hoffmeyer that since around the 8th to the 6th century BCE, the Red Sea has retreated from its ancient shoreline by 500 meters. Sounds like a lot, but this statement isn't really useful since it doesn't tell us how many feet the sea level has to drop to retreat 500 meters, which is about 546 yards or about 1,640 feet. As it happens, Hoffmeyer was referring to a previous statement that archaeologist Nelson Gluck made in his 1970 book, The Other Side of the Jordan, about the ruins of Tel el Khalifa, located near the northern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, which he initially incorrectly identified with Ezion Geber, Solomon's port. The relationship of Ezion Geber to the shoreline was merely surmised from the passage in 1 Kings 9:26. Since Gluck's identification has been widely rejected, and the ruins are of a fortress or garrison, which doesn't have to be right on the shore, Hoffmeyer's statement isn't helpful. The ruins of Tel el Khalifa are situated on a hill 500 meters from the shore of the Red Sea, but are only about 13 feet above the current level of the sea. This would seem to have a limiting effect on the ancient coastline at Taib al-Ism, which is well below the tens of feet Aston believed were needed, and the nearly 50 feet Potter requires. So this information doesn't really help the apologists after all. Potter and Aston know that raising the sea level alone won't solve their problem, so they speculate that the stream had a greater flow of water anciently. Both have argued that the flow rate of the spring has been greatly reduced due to the systematic pumping of water out of the wells in the region. This may indeed be the case, but neither of them have produced any evidence that the reduction of the amount of underground water has reduced the flow of Taib al-Ism's stream in recent times. They offer what they think is evidence that the stream was larger at one time, without being able to date it to Lehi's time. For all anyone knows, the evidence they deduce for a larger stream dates to hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years. They need to make a probable case. Otherwise, they are committing the fallacy of possible proof. Nevertheless, they have tried to prove that at some unspecified time in the past, a substantial river has flowed in the canyon for a very long time. Potter gave two kinds of evidence for this assertion. First, there is evidence of significant erosion of rocks on the floor and the lower canyon walls. Second, water-laid calcite deposits that are found on the valley floor are at times 15 to 20 feet wide, much wider than the current stream bed. At places in the canyon, one can find such deposits that have formed at higher levels on the rocks. We have measured these deposits 11 inches higher on the rocks than the level of the stream today. These observations point to the flow of a larger stream in the past, evidently long before the pumps were installed. The erosion is not proof of a larger permanent stream, but of millions of years of seasonal rains and flash flooding. In their 2003 book, Potter and Wellington state, a number of channels are cut in the floor of the upper valley, probably cut by flash floods. They would have to be cut by seasonal rains and flash flooding, since the upper valley is above the source of the stream. But the same explanation can be true of the channels cut in the floor of the canyon. They include this photo of Wellington's sons marking the current stream channel on the right, and a higher dry channel on the left, with the assertion underneath that this indicates that a sizable stream used to flow through the valley. No, it indicates no such thing. More likely, it indicates that erosion has changed the direction of the small stream to a lower part of the valley floor. The same explanation applies to the calcite deposits located at different places in the canyon, some of which are 11 inches higher than the current stream bed. This probably indicates that erosion has lowered the level of the stream, or redirected the stream to lower parts of the canyon. The other calcite deposits, measuring 15 to 20 feet wide, are located in the upper valley above the gravity-fed spring, and were necessarily laid down by seasonal rains. Again, the same explanation can be said of the calcite deposits in the canyon, and therefore do not provide evidence of a larger continuously running stream. Significantly, the calcite deposit evidence was dropped from the 2003 book. In his 2019 article, Aston responded to Chadwick's criticism that the present stream is too small and has no mouth, arguing in support of his theory that there has been a reduced flow of water over the last century due to expansions in farming and industrial usage. Aston quotes a 2018 email he received from Dr. Sherith Moses of the University of Sussex, who specializes in erosion or geomorphology. The smoothing of the rock surface along the lower sides of the valley indicates that there have been higher volumes of water flowing through the valley, probably in the past, but also, perhaps, associated with flash floods in the present day. Moses' wording is ambiguous, but Aston sees this statement as supporting his theory that a very substantial flow of water, a river, once ran through this valley over a very long period. But Moses didn't say a river once ran through the canyon, only that the erosion was evidence of high volumes of water once running through the canyon and currently runs in the form of flash flooding. Moses doesn't attempt to determine if the erosion on the canyon floor and walls was caused by a once continuously running river or flash flooding occurring over thousands or millions of years. Note also that the 3-foot erosion on the canyon walls doesn't mean that a 3-foot deep river ran through it, since the floor of the canyon has also eroded over a very long time. Aston also cites an article by the late John Twetness, who, among other things, taught Hebrew and linguistics at the University of Utah and ancient Near Eastern history and archaeology at BYU Jerusalem, which briefly explored 3 ancient historians who, he said, support the idea that there were rivers flowing in the western part of Arabia, both in Yemen to the south and in the land of Midian to the north, where Lehi encamped beside the river Laman. This led Aston to declare, "It seems certain that the river in Wadi Tayyib al-Ism is one of those described." However, the 3 sources Twetness cited appear to describe the area well south of Tayyib al-Ism, beginning with the broad plain to the east of the southern entrance into the Gulf of Aqaba. Twetness's main source is Strabo, a Greek geographer who lived in the 1st century BCE, who systematically described the lands and people of Arabia, starting at the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba and working his way south until he came to a plain well wooded, and well supplied with water, which Tuetnus associated with the Al-Makna region explored by Potter and Thorsted. There is no Al-Makna region. Al-Makna is simply the name of the first village along the coast below Taib al-Izm, both of which are in the Tabuk region. In other words, Tuetnus simply chose the name of the most northwestern city in the large plain described by Strabo that is closest to Taib al-Izm. Tuetnus makes it sound like Strabo first described the area near the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba in the south, and then moved north to the Al-Makna region to describe the plain. When he states, after describing the region of northwestern Arabia near the island of Tiran, and opposite the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula, he, Strabo, wrote, one comes next to a plain about the modern Al-Makna, which is well supplied with trees and water. The second bracketed note referring to Al-Makna is Tuetnus's. However, this is the opposite of what happens in the text. Strabo first describes the plain and then states, in front of this plain he had just described is an island called Dia, which seems to be the island of Tiran at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba. The plain Strabo described, therefore, is the area on this map labeled Ras Sheikh Hamid, as well as Sanam and Ar Rugama. More importantly, the source that Tuetnus associates with Al-Makna only states that there is a plain that is well supplied with trees and water, but says nothing about rivers, let alone about perennial rivers. Obviously, this can simply refer to the seasonal rains and temporary rivers in the wadis. Despite Aston's suggestion that Taib al-Izm was one of the rivers described, it is important to note that the ancient geographer, Strabo, skipped over the mountainous wadis as he worked his way down the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. Some apologists try to imply that the current situation at Taib al-Izm meets the requirements described in the Book of Mormon. The 2005 documentary, Journey of Faith, states that the stream at Wadi Taib al-Izm runs year-around, implying that it flows into the Red Sea year-around. This is a misleading attempt to fulfill the Book of Mormon's description of continually running and ignoring the into the fountain of the Red Sea part. Brown did the same thing in his 2007 article, The Hunt for the Valley of Lemuel, where he states Taib al-Izm features a river continually running, and then observes that it is the only wadi that drains into the Red Sea, implying that it does so continually. It is hoped that this video will help to put an end to the deceptively worded arguments and misuse of sources. Finally, in a desperate attempt to make Taib al-Izm fit the Book of Mormon's river Laman, apologist Jeff Lindsay suggested that the fountain of the Red Sea that the river flowed into was the subterranean waters of Hebrew mythology, rather than the Gulf of Aqaba as commonly understood. Lindsay, who is well known for his tortured interpretations and apologetic inventions, thus argues, if Nephi understood that the river Laman, as it sunk into the ground, was flowing into the subterranean waters that fed the Red Sea, possibly what he meant by the fountain of the Red Sea in 1 Nephi 2:9, then the place where that stream disappeared to enter the larger subterranean water would appropriately be called a mouth. In this way, Lindsay observes, the geography at Wadi Taib al-Izm would seem to relate well to the text, without the need to assume differences in elevation of the canyon in Lehi's day, or significant differences in the behavior of the stream. It sounds like Lindsay isn't convinced by the arguments of Potter, Wellington, and Aston, although he often quotes and defends them. Still, he has the audacity to claim Taib al-Izm is a perfect fit to Nephi's description. In arguing for a tectonic uplift and increased water flow for Tayyib al-Ism, Aston inadvertently created more problems for his theory. As mentioned, the text clearly states that Lehi pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water, and that the valley was in the borders near the mouth of the river. Naturally, the apologists associated the canyon at Tayyib al-Ism with the valley of Lemuel, although the wadi or upper valley continues on some 12 miles. Accordingly, they also located Lehi's campsite near the coastal entrance to the canyon. In 2007, Brown wrote, "The canyon, called Wadi Tayyib al-Ism, appears to fit snugly with Nephi's description of a valley firm and steadfast and immovable." In his 2015 book, Lehi and Sariah in Arabia, Aston included an illustration showing Lehi's tent at the mouth of the valley of Lemuel. In 2017, Book of Mormon Central posted a Google Earth photograph of Tayyib al-Ism with what they believed was a possible location for Lehi's campsite. Obviously, Lehi and his family couldn't pitch their tents in a canyon if a raging river was flowing through it, as Aston now maintains. So Aston instead locates the campsite about 3 miles farther east, near an oasis in the upper valley, about a half-mile beyond the canyon. Aston published this map in a 2020 article in the Apologetic Online Journal Interpreter, a journal of Latter-day Saint faith and scholarship. Now that Aston's proposed campsite is no longer in the canyon, but nearly 4 miles inland in the larger mountainous valley, it is difficult to account for the Book of Mormon's description of the valley and Lehi's campsite being near the mouth of the river. Potter, Wellington, and Aston have compared Wadi Tayyib al-Ism to Lehi's dream of a tree of life, which includes a river and a fountain, as well as a straight and narrow path with apparently a wrought iron railing. In January 2020, Aston posted a video on the Book of Mormon Central website showing flash flooding at Tayyib al-Ism, titled, "What Did the River of Filthy Water and the River Laman Look Like?" In this post, Aston wondered if the imagery in Lehi's dream of a river and fountain of filthy water was inspired by his seeing a flash flood at Tayyib al-Ism. Aston suggested that if Lehi had witnessed a flash flood, it would have likely been from the vantage point further inland, probably the oasis where the family would have camped. Obviously, Lehi could not have seen the mouth of the river at the bottom of the winding canyon from the oasis, more than 3 miles away. Aston even argues that Lehi was unaware initially that their encampment actually sat at the beginning of a wadi that descended some distance until it reached the Red Sea. Potter remarks, "Our candidate for the valley is less than 4 miles long, yet its towering walls permit seeing the Red Sea only during the last 375 yards as one descends to the coast." Aston doesn't inform us how exactly Lehi could discover the mouth of the river if the winding canyon was filled with a fast-moving river that was eroding the sides of the canyon. For Potter, the winding river and canyon fits the Book of Mormon's description. When Lehi first came into this valley, necessarily from its upper end, not from the coast, Potter argues, he apparently could not see from his camp that the river emptied into the sea. At least, that is implied by 1 Nephi 2, 6, and 9. This is a strained reading of the text, which gives no indication that the phrase in verse 9, "And when my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea," should be understood as a discovery that took place after Lehi set up camp in verse 6. Notably, the Book of Mormon doesn't say, "when my father discovered," which is used in other situations, and there is no indication that the text is following a strict chronological sequence of events, as some apologists maintain. Verse 8 had already mentioned that Lehi called the name of the river Laman, and it emptied into the Red Sea. When the next verse begins, And when my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the Red Sea, it merely functions as an introduction or transition to Lehi's declaration to Laman, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness." There are many scriptural examples of what might be called a literary formula or rhetorical technique, using "when he saw" and its variations, which have nothing to do with discovery. Also, if Lehi's dream is to be taken as analogous, the small stream in a winding canyon doesn't fit, because the Book of Mormon says that the river had depth, and also implies that the river was straight, stating that a rod of iron extended along the bank of the river and led to the tree, and that the straight and narrow path came along by the rod of iron. So apparently the rod, path, and river were all straight. Another aspect of the analogy is that Lehi could see his family at the head or source of the river, a little way off from his camp, which would not be possible either in the canyon or at the oasis at Taib al-Ism. Another indication that "when my father saw" doesn't mean discovered is that the text strongly implies that Lehi entered the valley from the coast, not from a back entrance. The inability of Lehi to access the canyon at Taib al-Ism from the coast is a serious problem. Chadwick observed, "The difficulties of identifying Taib al-Ism with the valley of Lemuel include its inaccessibility from the coast and it's difficult to find inland access." As previously mentioned, Joseph Smith had Lehi travel in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, which were in the borders near the Red Sea. This was only logical, but he didn't anticipate Lehi would run into an obstruction along the coast in the form of a huge granite mountain. This is contrary to Nephi's description. After reaching the Red Sea from Jerusalem, Lehi traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, meaning along the coast. This course was pursued until Lehi pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. This river emptied into the Red Sea, and the valley was in the borders near the mouth thereof. Thus, as Chadwick observed, the valley access was located not deep inside a mountain range, as in this Potter and Wellington's model, but very close to the seashore, not right at the seashore, but perhaps within 100 meters or so. As previously discussed, working his way through the maze of wadis from the coast inland to Taib al-Ism would have slowed Lehi down, making a 3-day trip from Aqaba highly improbable. In his 2019 article, Aston described the dilemma Lehi would have faced with so many choices and so little information. Along this coastline, several dry wadis lead up into the mountainous interior. Most of them run inland into the interior folds of rock before ending. However, 2 of these wadis, Wadi Hasha and about 7 kilometers further south, Wadi al-Hulab, stretch eastward up into the mountains to intersect with other interior wadis that then offer straightforward, perfectly feasible access to Wadi Taib al-Ism. Unlike Aston and Potter, Lehi would not have known where he was going. In his 2020 article, Aston made this even more difficult. If Lehi arrived in the area during the rainy season, when water was flowing in the upper valley at Wadi Taib al-Ism, as Aston now asserts, were not Wadi al-Hulab and other wadis near Bir Marsha, where Aston and Potter believe Lehi's family entered the mountainous network of wadis leading to Wadi Taib al-Ism, also flowing with water? If so, it would have made passage to the oasis more difficult, if not dangerous. In his 2002 article, Brown observed, "After rains, the seasonal streams in the wadis fill with mud and debris." In 2007, Brown further observed, The wadis near Bermarsha are dry. During the winter, however, as is the case with other dry stream beds in the area, they will spring to life as a result of winter rains. Chadwick suggested that the wadis near Bermarsha were flowing with streams when Lehi arrived, and that he set up his camp partway up one of them. Aston had earlier assumed the wadis at Bermarsha were dry when Lehi arrived in the area. However, when he was forced to move Lehi's camp to the oasis and needed a stream to be running past it, water was likely running in the wadis at Bermarsha as well, making the 3-day journey to Taib al-Izm even less feasible. The impossible 3-day journey from Jerusalem to the Gulf of Aqaba and the lack of a valley with a river that perpetually runs into the Red Sea points to Joseph Smith as the Book of Mormon's author. Little was known about Arabia in his day, but he would have certainly consulted a map of some kind, although he would have little appreciation for the actual distances and terrain involved. Apologists have discussed 4 possible routes Lehi could have taken from Jerusalem to the Red Sea, but Joseph Smith would have probably only known about the direct route through the Araba Valley to the Gulf of Aqaba. As Lehi approached the Red Sea, the text says he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea and then traveled in the wilderness in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, which seems to suggest that he traveled a short distance along the coast in a southeast direction, as we later learn. After a total of 3 days of travel in the wilderness, Lehi pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water, which he named after his 2 oldest sons. This 3-day miscalculation, previously discussed, indicates that Joseph Smith located the valley of Lemuel and river Laman somewhere near the tip of the Gulf, which Nephi called the fountain of the Red Sea. It just so happens that right at this location, near the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, according to some early maps, there was one of 2 canals, or rivers, or what were sometimes called gulfs, harbors, or even creeks, that never existed. It has been called a forked tongue of the Gulf of Aqaba. It is conceivable that Joseph Smith viewed the eastern canal with a narrow opening as the river Laman. Not all maps showed these canals, but a fair number did. Some of these maps appeared in James Gee's article, The Nahum Maps, published in the Journal of Book of Mormon and Restoration Scripture in 2008. But one map in particular, published in London in 1794, includes some interesting topography in light of the previous discussion. In this map, published in London in 1794, it looks like the Western Canal is actually a continuation of the Gulf, and that the canal or river, as expected, is a little down the eastern coast of Aqaba. It is labeled Minet Idahab, or Gold Haven, because it was believed that this is where Solomon built his port of Ezion-Geber and imported gold from Ophir. Joseph Smith may have imagined Lehi traveling down the east coast of Aqaba until he reached the mouth of what he thought was a river, and chose this location as a good place for Lehi to pitch his tent. From this location, Nephi and his brothers made 2 trips back to Jerusalem, and Lehi later received the compass-like instrument called the Liahona. Note that on the map the Canal River is in a valley and that the mountain range on the eastern side exists only near its mouth, which fits the Book of Mormon's description. The Canal River is also straight and has depth, which fits Lehi's dream. Being an actual valley instead of a canyon, Lehi's group could cross the river and continue their journey along the coast in a southeastern direction. Also, it's worth noting the possibility that what Joseph Smith called borders was the green shading around the edges of the Red Sea, which appears in most of my examples in various colors. To show that this feature at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba is not rare or an anomaly, I will present a few more examples. In his 2008 article, Guy included a few more maps that are pertinent to this discussion. Most show the river or canal, but not the mountain ranges on both sides of the river. The following are those printed in the United States and Great Britain. This map, published in London in 1755, labels the Eastern Canal Port of Gold and shows mountains only on one side. This map, published in London in 1791, labels it Menet Idahab, or Port of Gold. A similar unpainted map appears in Monsieur Danville's Compendium of Ancient Geography, published in London in 1791, where on page 441 there is mention of this eastern canal. Ezion Geber, whence the fleets of Solomon took their departure for Ophir, was an open port at the head of the most eastern creek of the Elanite Gulf, Gulf of Aqaba. The Arabic name Menet Idahab, signifying the port of gold, had reference to the riches that were there debarked on the return from Ophir. This place is now called Kalat el Aqaba, which signifies Castle of the Descent. It is also called a creek in J.E. Worcester's A Geographical Dictionary or Universal Gazetteer, Ancient and Modern, 2 volumes, Andover, Massachusetts, 1817. Aqaba, or Kalat el Aqaba, Fortress, Arabia Petrea, at the northern extremity of the eastern creek of the Bahr el Aqaba, or Elanitic Gulf. It was an ancient port of the Edomites, and called in Scripture Ezion Geber. This map, published in London in 1804, labels it Menet Idahab, or Gold Harbor. This map, published in London in 1811, shows the canal but doesn't name it. This map, published in Scotland in 1814, like map 8 by John Carey, London 1804, labels it Menet Idahab, or Gold Harbor. This concludes my use of the maps published by James Guy in 2008. I have a few other maps that should be considered as well. This map, published in Philadelphia in 1817, labels the eastern branch Gulf Idababa, or Good Gulf. This map has no labels, but is most interesting in showing the mountain ranges. It was published by Matthew Carey and Son in Philadelphia in 1820 in a book titled A Complete Genealogical, Historical, Chronological, and Geographical Atlas, and was essentially a reprint of an 1807 book with the same title published in London by C.V. Lavoisna, which was an expanded version published in 1801 under the pseudonym of A. Lesage. The map is titled Canaan, with part of Egypt, during the residence of the Israelites in the desert, and was included in a section of the book titled Geographical and Historical Maps, Illustrative of Sacred History. Apparently, this section was released separately as an aid in Bible study, which would have been an easy way for Joseph Smith to get his hands on a map. Interestingly, an 1828 version of the map removed the two canals. This map, published in London in 1754 and in France in 1773, doesn't name the port, but shows the mountain ranges. Here is a colorized version. Blair's Chronology and History of the World went through many editions throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The cartographers of some of these maps put a mountain range between the ancient cities of Elah, now Eilat, and Aqaba. However, a look at images showing the topography of the floor of the Gulf shows that this could not have existed. These maps show that we can now dismiss the apologetic pronouncements that Joseph Smith could not have known there was a river in Arabia, and the discovery of Taib al-Ism with its small spring is proof of the Book of Mormon's historicity. In their 2003 book, Lehi in the Wilderness, Potter and Wellington ask, how can we be certain that the Wadi Taib al-Ism is the Book of Mormon's Valley of Lemuel? And then state, the answer is easy. Nephi made detailed assertions about the valley and its river, and the Wadi Taib al-Ism matches all these characteristics perfectly. Prior to Potter's discovery of Taib al-Ism, when the Hiltons were touting the oasis at Al-Bad as the Valley of Lemuel, BYU professor of English Eugene England, in a 1982 article titled, Through the Arabian Desert to a Bountiful Land, Could Joseph Smith Have Known the Way? Declared, about 3 days in the wilderness from Aqaba, 76 miles, along the Frankincense Trail, is the large oasis of Al-Bada, an impressive valley with a riverbed that flows dramatically after rain, and a flowing stream that waters substantial crops, all conditions that fit exactly the Valley of Lemuel. Some apologists have been too eager to declare that the Valley of Lemuel has been found. Certainly, they have overstated their case. We have seen that their so-called perfect matches or exact fits came only after a great deal of manipulation of the data. Taib al-Ism matches the Book of Mormon's description of the Valley of Lemuel perfectly, only if one accepts all their modifications to the present condition of the wadi and contorted interpretations of the text. That is, if you lower the canyon by 50 feet and greatly increase the water flow from the spring. If Lehi came during the rainy season. If you decrease the distance from Aqaba to the valley by at least 16 miles. If you ignore the disqualifying requirements, like the river having a mouth and the valley being near that mouth, then perhaps it fits perfectly. Brown is a little more cautious, stating, although I cannot solve all the issues, this site remains, in my mind, the most secure candidate for the Valley of Lemuel. It doesn't seem to occur to the apologists that it's not a matter of choosing the best candidate and overlooking the problems if the best candidate is still inadequate. In their preoccupation to create plausibility for the Book of Mormon, the apologists seem unwilling to consider the probability that there never was a perennial river that continually emptied into the Red Sea. In his 2005 review of Potter and Wellington's book, Chadwick concluded, no realistic assessment of the features of Taib al-Ism and its stream can match Nephi's description. I think my discussion here has made it abundantly clear that Chadwick's assessment still stands. Despite all their great efforts, the truth remains that there is no place in Saudi Arabia that matches Nephi's description of the Valley of Lemuel and River Laman. In my view, the apologists themselves have proved it. I also think I have demonstrated that there is a better candidate for the river described in 1 Nephi, that Joseph Smith's contemporaries called the Gulf of Gold or Gold Harbor. According to the maps, it is in the right place. It's in a valley. It's straight. It has a mouth and depth, and it continually flows into the fountain of the Red Sea. Of course, it has the major flaw of probably never existing. Until next time, I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for listening.